Today on the Keen on Yoga podcast, we have Laura von Ostrowski. I managed to say that correct, so always a sigh of relief. She's a yoga teacher, first and foremost, and also a PhD graduate in Indology and Indian studies, I think.
Religious studies.
No, we can't say Indology and Indian studies, can we? It's a bit of a,
religious studies.
I don't know what we say, tautology. So anyway, religious studies, and the particular topic we're going to talk about today, really, well, partly I think we're going to have a little chat about embodiment and how it relates to the modern practice, but really, Laura has done a PhD on how to apply the Yoga Sutras to the modern practitioner. So this is a topic which has constantly frustrates me, and let's just see what Laura has to say on this, because from the outset, we don't see it as immediately obvious how to apply a classical philosophy to, which is talking about disembodiment, to a practice today in today's world, which seems to be more about getting into the body. So welcome, Laura, anyway, to Keen on Yoga.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Should have asked you before to say hello, but it's lovely to have you here. I've tried to... I've been waiting, in fact. I listened to a podcast with Daniel Simpson, so credit to Daniel, and it's a great episode. And, I've been waiting for your PhD to be translated into English. So someone out there who's obviously fluent in German and English needs to do that, because I'm sure Laura probably has better things to do now than look back at her PhD. Probably don't ever see that thing again. As I assume everyone says about PhD, hardest thing you can ever do. Lucky that I didn't do it. Probably not smart enough anyway. But anyway, Laura, how should we start this? I mean, there's certain sutras that I pulled up in preparing this interview and sent them over to Laura. I mean, things like Chitta Vritti Nirodha, for example. And I know that the thing is, I think, with a modern practitioner, as I was saying to Laura before, is that it's almost like we don't take Patanjali literally enough, but then we're often too simplistic, in a way too literal at the same time. So, for example, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, I would suggest Patanjali, who seems to be a man of few words, really, it kind of doesn't seem to be doesn't beat around the bush, as it were, is saying that exactly that, the Nirodha, the stoppage, the cessation of the mind altogether. But the modern practitioner seems to like to translate it otherwise. So I think we're parrying, and I'll let you speak now, Laura, between two worlds, really. One is the world of being honest and being appropriate with the material we have, the Yoga Sutras as Patanjali meant them. And on the other hand, how the hell are we going to make this stuff appropriate to the practices we have today that we don't probably want to stop the mind. We don't probably want to decimate the ego or things like this. We have a more positive worldview, let's say, than Patanjali perhaps did.
Yes. Thanks, Adam, for the introduction. I mean, there's so much I have to say about that, and I'm worrying that this will not happen, that I can say everything. So,
do what you can. I've spoken enough.
Yes. First of all, my PhD was about observing how in the 21st century, Patanjali is connected to the physical practice, especially to Ashtanga yoga, because not in every yoga style that we have nowadays in modernity, Patanjali has such a big role to play as, for example, in Ashtanga yoga. And I found it very interesting that Ashtanga yoga, according to Pattabhi Jois, because of course it changed from Krishnamacharya to Pattabhi Jois, has some methods, like physical methods, that seem to be related to contents of the Yoga Sutra. For example, Tristana. According to my knowledge, I mean, you know more about the Ashtanga tradition than I do. But according to my knowledge, Tristana, these 3 concentration points in your practice, Drishti and Bandha, and I don't know, Vinyasa, or sometimes
posture, Bandha,
and sometimes it's also posture, asana. These are connected to, for example, Patanjali's concentration, or dharana, or restricting the senses. So I found it very interesting that we have practices, and I think Tristana was a word that was shaped by Jois or coined by Jois. That is, according to
we don't
my
see it in
knowledge,
Krishnamacharya's books, or what you said. Yeah,
that's it.
Must come from Pattabhi Jois.
But there is a practice that somehow has certain tools to frame the Yoga Sutra in a practical way. And one of the main topics that the Yoga Sutra revolves around is an extremely high concentration. And of course, we have Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the first sutra, which is not only an extremely high concentration, but that would also mean that the mind is somehow without content. It's contentless. It's something that we cannot really imagine, I think, as human beings that we are, yeah. But it's a samadhi state, like a extremely high concentration state. And I think it would not be right to say that. And also, that's what I just found out during my whole work during my PhD, to say that, for example, practical methods we find in Ashtanga yoga or also in other yoga styles, of course, they lead to that sort of samadhi that Patanjali is talking about. I think we should be clear about that, and I think that's honest, and that's also down to earth to say that. But I think that there are practices in yoga and also in other movement styles, but maybe in modern yoga styles, these practices are very highlighted and they are effective to get us into concentration states and in states of absorption sometimes. And I really wanted to find out what in modern practice is effective on a body level and then also on the level of the mind, because body and mind are always interconnected. That's what embodiment theories tell us. And that's, I think, also what we experience in our daily life and in our practice. That how do these practices get us into a state of concentration, into a state of absorption? And for example, for Ashtanga yoga, and it's different in other static styles, the flow state is something that regularly happens when we practice. And flow state, I think, is not what Patanjali meant with samadhi, but maybe it can be deemed as a small samadhi, as a very, let's say, micro samadhi. And we also see in the Yoga Sutra, in the commentary part, in the Bhashya, but I might say more about that later if you want to, that he says, there is this samadhi that I'm talking about, so samadhi, the yoga, samadhi that is yoga. But there are other samadhi states, daily life samadhi states. He says that in his commentary. And these small or micro samadhis, I think we can get them through our practice and also through other things we are doing because we are just very focused or concentrated and so on. So I think it's very worth to look at the practices we're doing, to also look at maybe studies that come out about these practices and see how do they really affect us, and then see how could that relate to the Yoga Sutra. Does it? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But there are actually some parts of this practice that can get us absorbed and concentrated. And that might be a very good start to maybe then meditate longer or whatever. So I find that very interesting. And when we have Patanjali in mind, we also look for, let's say, for example, deep concentration states in our practice that changes what we do with Patanjali in the background.
Yeah. I think, you touched upon many, many points in that. One of them I immediately think of is that there's a back and forth that I think it's easy to think, well, the kind of validity of our practices is based on looking at Patanjali and then kind of simply translating that immediately into the context of practice, rather than thinking, well, actually, the experience we're having in practice is equally as informative and valid and interesting as Patanjali, right? They both carry weight. So then it's like, well, relating the two together. What am I experiencing, which is valid, in the modern context, because yoga has always been very context sensitive, as we know through the ages. It's changed, dramatically, exponentially, and then, what's Patanjali saying? How can we kind of understand better the experiences that we're having on the mat through looking at Patanjali, whilst also preserving, as you rightly say, that he's saying one thing that we have to be clear. Maybe we don't want all of that today, but maybe we want some of it. I think someone else, maybe Daniel Simpson actually talks about Patanjali light or Yoga Sutras light,
yes,
that kind of makes sense, like Patanjali is a pretty heavy kind of guy, and he sees the world as simply pain in the end, and the answer to remove ourselves from the world. So it doesn't mean that we negate Patanjali altogether as irrelevant now, because he says a lot of interesting things, particularly about practice and about psychology. So how can we kind of kind of amend him whilst preserving, okay, this is what he did say, and this is what we're doing, and how we want to and he gives good pointers, let's say, good guidance as to what we might be better doing, right? But whilst also recognizing that Ekagrita is a one-pointed focus, and we're also doing one-pointed focus, but yeah, perhaps we're not doing it to the degree of coming into pure consciousness, let's say.
Yes.
I think someone said to me recently, why is no one in Ashtanga become enlightened? It was a conversation I had with someone, actually.
What was the question?
Why has no one in Ashtanga Yoga become enlightened?
Oh, yes,
right?
that's a very good question.
Why don't we know anyone who's enlightened? If we're following the Yoga Sutras, why has, surely someone has used it to ascend the ladder, and become enlightened. And why hasn't this happened? So, I mean, there's someone else like Guy Donaghy, who I've interviewed on the Yoga Sutras after a little run-in online or disagreement, who would say that the Yoga Sutras is actually... we do experience it. We do experience enlightenment. We just don't recognize it. So he's quite literal in his approach to the Yoga Sutras. But I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyways,
I'm also not sure. I think it really has to serve us. I also interviewed Ashtanga yoga teachers, and what they said seemed to me as if they deemed themselves as enlightened. And
they suggested they were.
Yes, I mean, I think they suggested they were. Yes, and
like who?
I'm not naming anybody. But
oh God, go on.
No.
Oh, that's funny.
No.
Well, surely if they suggested they were enlightened, to be happy to be called out on that. I'll get them on next and see what I can do. Yeah.
It's good to only suggest it and not to make a hard statement that you can be quoted with.
Exactly.
So, and I think it might just. I cannot quote. I don't know. Was it Buddha? I cannot quote anybody, but I think thinking that you are enlightened might already show that you are not. That
something
someone
like
said
that. Buddha
that.
would have
I
said
don't know who
something like
said
that. It's like cheeky. Yeah.
Yes. So.
Sure.
And I'm also not, it looks a bit, I don't know if you have that saying in English too, like a carrot on the stick, you're always running after a goal, but in the moment that you're running after that goal, I think you already lost track somehow, because you might just come into a realm where you think that you are, but you lost the real practical way. I'm not sure about that. It's quite a difficult realm, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what about how do we phrase it then? If we're not actually looking to my understanding of the Chitta Vritti, and I go back to this again because people will, constantly say, well, Brahmacharya, no, it doesn't mean celibacy. Patanjali just meant just have sex with one person at a time. All these kind of retranslation of Patanjali.
That's what Krishnamacharya said, for example. So it is a retranslation of Brahmacharya. Yeah. That is,
yeah. I suppose if Krishnamacharya is saying, we have to. we can't say anything bad about it, but I mean, come on, it's like in all tantric practices and all yogic practices, the celibacy has been prerequisite, right? So it doesn't mean that we have to be again. It just means that looking at the time, that's what he said, and then it's like, well, now you know everything. Now go play with it. Like, decide what you want to do, decide what you don't want to do, and then recognize the results. See how it works for you. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it? So what do we do with the Nirodha then? What can we do with this cessation of the mind? How could we translate it to a different kind of thing? And I suppose going on to that, Laura, my question would be, Nirodha also suggests a complete absence of the personality as we know it, the ego as we know it. So then what do we do with the ego in practice? According to Patanjali and according to you.
Practice.
Yeah, the ego. Ego. Not the ego. Yeah.
Well, I am a researcher. I'm an Indologist. I'm trained in a certain way to read the Yoga Sutra. I just have to say that once because I think it's very important. I have been trained by, of course, Indologists that have certain knowledge about the sutra and its commentaries. So that has been lots of time I've spent in these translations, in these articles about the sutra, also Philip Ma's work, of course. But then I've also been trained by Pandits in India. So, and these are intellectuals. These are not people that are having a physical yoga practice, but they are philosophers. And they, Ja's professor and Ja and his wife. They've been here to Munich to teach the Yoga Sutra, and I was in Bangalore for 3 weeks to study the Sankhya Karika with them. And it was all in Sanskrit. They had all the 5-6 commentaries in front of them, and they were reading a sutra, and never a sutra pure. They always had one commentary, the next commentary, the next commentary. It took them 2 hours to look at one sutra, and then afterwards they said, well, according to all these commentaries, we can say that kind of the big framework of meaning of that sutra is this. They would never just have. So this is my training, and I know that I have to also apply that to my practice, to modern life, and so on. And I do, but I always keep that in mind. So just keep in mind that this is where I come from. And you are having a very, let's say, realistic view on the Yoga Sutra and where it comes from and its contents, it seems to me. But many people don't, because they're not taught in that. But when we look at the first sutra, to come back to Chitta Vritti Nirodha, it is meant for a yogi. And who is a yogi, or has been the yogi that Patanjali talks about? It's been a Brahmin, it's been a male ascetic, and this person has a certain lifestyle. He has vows, the Mahavratas. So this person is a different person than we are. And I think, first of all, we need to understand that, because then we don't identify 100% with the person Patanjali talks about, but we keep some, let's say, distance, and I think a very important and maybe also liberating distance from the text, and then it can still inspire us. Yeah. So this is first of all what I want to say. So this Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha is for a yogin. It's for someone who is on that path since a long time. So, and I think just comparing ourselves with that is something that might not be useful and might kind of distract us. But surely, as I said at the beginning, what we can take out of that today is that we observe our minds. Where does it go? How does it think? How full is it? How empty? And how can we change that with our practices that we do? And then how can we come to a more heightened state of concentration? And that doesn't mean that there's nothing in our mind anymore afterwards, but that means that it kind of leans towards what Patanjali meant. But we are different people. We have constant influences in this world. That many of us are parents. We have children. We are in very different circumstances. And the world changed, in the 21st century. There's so much happening that Patanjali didn't know about, and did not give us any insights into how to deal with social media or how to deal with all these things that change our minds, But if we observe our minds, which is very important, and which Patanjali actually tells us to do, and then if we find always get back to concentration and focus, I think that's already quite something.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all to recognize, many people translate the first sutra, which we haven't talked about, Atha Yoga Nutsasanam.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm always talking about the second sutra.
Yes, well, no, the second sutra is the big one, suggesting the full aim of yoga, isn't it? But the first sutra, I think, is interesting because people often say, well, this is the continuation of yoga, suggesting a continuation of the teaching, or other people say, well, now starts yoga. Obviously, now starts yoga is the actual literal translation, but it seems to me what he's really saying was well, now with you group of people who have decided to renounce the world and become ascetics and listen to this, this is obviously my particular rendering of this. Listen to this, that this is the message, So he's not talking to everyone, and he's not suggesting to talk to everyone. That's the Bhagavad Gita. But for some reason, people always like the Yoga Sutras better than the Bhagavad Gita, maybe because it's shorter and easy to read, superficially anyway. But it gets more interesting, and it's been rendered. And I think because because of the fact that not loads of work has been done on it. This is not my opinion, actually, but it's one I've heard, that it's actually quite open to interpretation. Like, we're going to get onto the modern interpreters such as Vivekananda on the Yoga Sutras and how it was used. But it's a good text because it's not like, well, certain esteemed pundits have done loads of work on this in the past. So it's like, well, you can tinker around with it a little bit. But
Yes.
this idea that, as you say, that it's not for the normal person, it's for the ascetic. And if you look at the yamas that people like to say all the time, I try and use the yamas in my daily life. It's like, well, great. I mean, but that's a kind of given for a yogi, that you wouldn't be trying to be violent. It's a bit of a tautology, really. It's like, and certainly for Patanjali to say, well, first guys, first and foremost, don't be violent. It's like, well, they're doing so much, it hardly needs to be said. So my suggestion in reading those vows is, if you look at the monks' vows that we've had universally in all cultures, chastity, obedience, poverty, poverty, just chastity, obedience. They're the universal monks' vows, right? And they're the yamas, right? Poverty, asteya and aparigraha. If you're really not stealing in the capitalist world, you cannot interact in business at all, which is all business is essentially based on exploitation in one form or another. That's capitalism, right?
Yes.
And chastity, well, brahmacharya, as you said, Krishnamacharya was an innovator, but he was an innovator. He translated it for the modern person and that's why he's been, he was so successful. And then the obedience part, well, Ishvara Pranadhana, pay your obeisances to the god, put yourself under Ishvara. So, my rendering is that the monk's vows, and ahimsa is, in fact, I'm just going to say this and I'll let you go on there. Ahimsa, sorry, ahimsa is actually a non-action in the world. Right? So, if you're acting in the world, it's inherently, according to Patanjali, going to be violent in the end. That all action, according to Patanjali, results in pain and violence to someone or something. So
Yes.
he's suggesting it's not to do only non-violent actions, but just, go into the monastery and don't act in the world at all. And hence, you're living in ahimsa. Anyway, Laura, carry on.
Yeah, I think the yamas are a very interesting field to look at when rendering Patanjali into modernity or the 21st century, because they seem so practical, and I think even they seem more practical than the 10 Commandments, because there's a lot of the first ones are all about how to treat God, and if you are an atheist, so how do you deal with that? It's not like an ethical somehow, commandment. And but I have to say, I think sometimes because we are just looking at these sutras, which are somehow the essence or whatever of a bigger text. And this bigger text is called Patanjali Yoga Shastra. And it is very clear that the sutra part, like these 195 or 196 sutras, they have never been transmitted just by themselves until the second millennium. With Bojaraja, it starts that he takes out the sutra part and disrespects the rest of the whole big work and the Bhashya part and writes his own commentary. And that just continues on and on, that this work is changed. Yeah. For example, Vijnana Bhikshu is very known for Vedanticizing the sutra. It happened before too, but so that it is a Vedantic work after all. I mean, it would take some time to elaborate on that, but I think we have listeners that know already a bit about monistic and dualistic traditions. And so the Yoga Sutra was changed in the second millennium from a from a dualistic to a monistic philosophy. So the text changed. And because we only take out these sutras and we try to understand them with our modern mind and maybe some commentaries of Desikachar or whoever wrote modern commentaries, we sometimes don't see that there is so much written in the Bhashya part for the sutra, for the small sutra. For example, in the Yamas, for Ahimsa, the Bhashya says, like the commentary part says very clearly, in, I think, 231, because 230 are the Yamas and 231 is the Mahavrata, the big, I don't know, how would you translate that in English, vrata, like a big sermon or no?
Sermon, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the great
And
sermon.
he says, if you are a fisherman, then you can kill fishes, but otherwise ahimsa. And so, it's actually very practical. For the Mahabharata, the big sermon is for the yogin, for the one who renounced the world.
Vyasa commentary.
Yeah, that's Vyasa's Bhashya.
Yeah.
But for and this, some say, like Philip Maas, it is Patanjali or the same author of Patanjali's text written that. But even if not, it's very old. It's from the 5th century Common Era. So it's a very, very old interpretation of the sutra, part of the small sentence of ahimsa. And if this really old text says, well, the Mahabharata, the big sermon, is for a yogin. But if you are living in the world and you are, for example, a fisherman, kill fishes, but don't kill deers. It's getting practical, actually. And I think that's might be just what we can do with that, to apply it. Yeah. Whom do I have to harm? Because like insects, or I'm not a Jain walking with a little, brush to not kill any insect. Like we are doing harm. And I think it's very honest to really look at what we are doing, but then also what can we do to avoid it as much as possible. And I think then we already do a lot, much more than many other people do. Yeah. And just this work of reflection on that, I think, is very important. And this differentiates, for example, yoga from other movement practices, because we have that in background, Patanjali's words and also other texts of Hatha Yoga and so on. We have that in our background, and we are searching for concentration, and we are searching for how can we do less harm and so on. But I think it's getting difficult if we are over exaggerating, because we are not that kind of yogin. We don't have that lifestyle.
I think that's a great point, actually. So to use the sutras as kind of contemplation or reflection points ourselves, and it's a subtle one, rather than simply following them. So one thing's like to say, well, because following them would say either one, it kind of trying to authenticate our practice by simply say, well, that's what it means in terms of Patanjali, or a kind of, to put it in modern parlance, modern speak, virtue signaling. Oh, I'm living, I'm living the Yoga Sutras. I'm living Ahimsa. So, but instead of that, just thinking, well, these are the Yamas, or these are different sutras of reflection, and just kind of turning them over, as I would assume that Patanjali expected in the first place, to kind of being bullet points to greater thinking processes. How does that actually feel in my life? How does where do I stand with killing a fish or killing a deer or whatever? Rather than thinking, well, this is what Patanjali means, and in order to be a good yogi, in order to be right, in order to validate my practice, I should follow this. Rather than thinking, well, okay, this is a sutra to contemplate and just make me think more. Like,
Yes.
What about harm in the world? When I order online, when I order stuff on Amazon, and I'm not saying I don't do it, I do it all the time. But how does it affect other people? Like the faceless others that are there, inevitably suffering some form of suffering to fulfill my order, etc., etc., etc. Right? You cannot not cause harm in the world. But then again, being realistic and thinking, well, where do I stand on that? What can I do? What do I want to do? And what am I, to be honest, going to ignore right now, because I cannot cope with doing more, because I'm, in other words, like, as you said, a normal person, in inverted commas, with a life, with a family, with responsibilities, and not an ascetic living in the forest or a monastery. The forest, probably.
That's it.
Yeah.
And then, can I add something to the Yamas?
Please. Yep. Please do.
I find it very interesting when I did research on Krishnamacharya's teachings, and I read his Yoga Makaranda from, I think, 1934, his first book that he wrote in his time in the Mysore Palace. And do you know how many Yamas he is enlisting?
First of all, he lists about 12, doesn't he? And then he or 10 or 12. Yeah, 10. And then he streamlines it later in the book, I believe.
Yeah, like in the Tanagalu from his 1940s, we only find the 5 Yamas of Patanjali.
Yeah, but first of all, I remember that.
First work, it's really 10. And I looked at where do they come from. And as A.G. Mohan said, I think he often said that. Krishnamacharya might have been even more shaped by the Yoga Yajnavalkya, like a Hatha Yoga text of the second millennium, or also by later works like Brahmananda's commentary on the Hatha Pradipika, the Jyotsna, it's called. And there we find 10 yamas indeed. So, and I cannot all enlist them, but there's one, I think, that's called mitahara, that means eat moderately. But also, when we look at the Yoga Yajnavalkya, it says the yogin should eat, I think, 8 mouthful. But a grahasta, someone who stays in a house and has a family, should eat, I think, 32 mouthful. So this text is from the 14th century, as good as I remember. And the Yoga Yajnavalkya, I mean, where the 10 yamas are enlisted, and that might have been a big influence on Krishnamacharya. And this text, it just says, there is this yogin. He should eat, of course, little, because what is he doing? He has to concentrate and sit and meditate. But if you are a householder, if you are in your household phase, please eat, because you need, but then eat still moderately, like eat what you need, don't eat more. And I think if we look at, also we have that in our tradition of modern yoga. We come from Krishnamacharya, Padabi Joyce, BKC Iyengar, and so on. This is our lineage, if you want to. And of course, there are many, many other influences coming onto that. We can talk about that too. But we are coming already from modern interpretations of Patanjali. And they have been, as I said, started already in the second millennium with the Vedantization of the sutra, with the connection of sutra parts with Hatha Yoga texts. This comes up in the 17th, 18th century. So we see that the sutra was, let's call it, watered down, or some parts were selected and other parts were disregarded. This has a whole history. This has a long history, and Krishnamacharya taps on that history. Sometimes he cites from Hatha Yoga texts, sometimes more from the Yoga Sutra, and so on. But there are more yamas in traditions. Maybe not in the Yoga Sutra, but maybe the Yoga Sutra said only these 5 because they're relevant for the monastic, for the ascetic. And then if we know that, so what could be an important yama in today's world that is not in the Yoga Sutra? I think it's very valid to ask that, because also in the Indian tradition, there have never been only that 5 ones, and they have been adapted to different kind of people also in old texts like the Yoga Yajnavalkya. I think that relaxes a bit.
Well, I thought also realizing that within Indian traditions, like great figures like Patanjali were also innovators that that took responsibility for thinking and looking at older texts and making their own minds up. And I think my suggestion would be that the advanced practitioner, the efficient practitioner, effective one these days would also be taking responsibility and thinking, well, how far do I want to go with things? What does this mean for me? These kind of questions, looking at the text and taking responsibility for the interpretation, whilst not, being careful also not to appropriate as well and say, well, this means this, but it doesn't. I mean, we have a lot of that these days. And I remember talking to Edwin Bryant. He said, he only wrote that book because he was kind of frustrated because everyone was saying all these kind of things about the Yoga Sutras, and and it wasn't true because they never read the commentaries. And of course, a lot of us don't have the time or ability to read the commentaries, and they're tough and they're arduous. And as a segue, would you actually recommend? I mean, can people just get stuck into the commentaries, or would you have a recommendation if people, because you're mentioning the Bhashya, and many people are starting to recognize that there is a commentary behind the Yoga Sutras. I didn't realize it until I think I was speaking to Edwin that there was even a commentary, and many people are going to probably think, well, I should probably read that then. Can they just start reading it like that, or would you recommend a particular translation?
It is difficult. I mean,
how to get into it, how to approach it. Is it relevant? Do you need to read it in the first place? Let's maybe start there.
I of course have Hariharananda's rendering of the commentary. This is the youngest authoritative commentary that we have is Hariharananda's rendering
Hariharananda
of
in commentary.
Bhashya and Yoga Sutra.
Yeah.
It's very big. You see that. And I think if you just read it by yourself, there are very strange things written in there and you might get very lost. So it could be good to have a teacher or someone who has some knowledge about Sankhya philosophy, because Sankhya is a big philosophical background of the Yoga Sutra. And then you have all these specialized terms in there, the gunas and so on, and then you might get lost. So I think actually it's going to be a collective effort of the yoga community in the next decades to really look at this tradition and what it had to say, and to then extract out of, like, let's say, the bigger tradition, not only the few sutras that we call the Yoga Sutra, but to extract out of the bigger tradition what we can to let's say, serve our practice. And maybe it will also change our practices. I'm not sure, but it's possible. And then at the same time to also see, okay, in the commentary it's written, this is a text for Brahmins. If you just read the sutra parts, you could ignore that. You could say, well, it's for everybody and so on. But if you read the commentary, you have to look at it. You have to see it is written for certain people, for a certain public.
Very few.
And also, I
very
think
select group.
For me, it relaxed me. I mean, I read it with Sanskrit teachers and with pundits, as I said, so I was not alone with that. I think I would just have put it aside again. But it relaxed me because I see what was the original context. I'm in another context, but what can I still do with that today? I think it's relaxing, and it also gives you mental clarity, and that's something we want, right? So it gives you mental clarity about what did this text say, and how did this change also during the last centuries, because the text was like already since a few hundreds of years not written with a commentary anymore. Like Krishnamacharya did it, but Krishnamacharya said, at least he said that in his later years to a student, Claude Maréchal. I don't know if you knew him. But he said to him, the Yoga Sutra is not practical enough. It's not devotional enough. We have to change the meaning of the sutra to render it more practical and more devotional. That's at least what Claude Maréchal said in an interview.
Right. I mean, I know that Krishnamacharya loved the Yoga Sutras, and I mean, Jessica Charles' book, and I've heard it, I think with A.G. Mohan as well. He pointed out that the Yoga Sutras was the main text to use when Jessica Charles asked him what was the fundamental text, and Pattabhi Jois must have got Ashtanga yoga from somewhere. I mean, we know that Krishnamacharya didn't call his yoga Ashtanga yoga; he called it Yoga Kurunta, didn't he? But nevertheless, he had I think over and above any other text, Krishnamacharya did have a love for the Yoga Sutras. So there must be something particular there. But obviously, yes, he was.
And he read it with a commentary.
And he was also party to a little bit of fiddling with let's say with synthesizing many different ideas into things.
True.
And to make them practical, to make them useful to people, which I think is but also to recognize that they also have a traditional precedent.
Yes.
As well. There's a term maybe you can help me with this, that one is looking within the culture, so you look at the text and don't question it like as face value, and the other is, say, what we're doing, which is to be looking and cross-culturally referencing from the outside.
You mean emic and etic, or
yes. That's it. Everything. So I think it's we have to make clear here that what we're doing is I believe etic, is that right? Yeah, good. So we're looking from the outside, from a Western perspective, and from a culture, from a kind of modern scholarly perspective of referencing different things and looking at the text with a certain amount of circumspection, rather than diving in and following the text, as these are the words that have been revealed to us, and we follow them and without questioning. And I think it's clear to, it's useful at this point to say perhaps that, that this is what we are doing, because I know that there are many, a number of listeners that will listen to this, and like we have on Edwin Bryant's Bhagavad Gita, and say, well, you're questioning a text which isn't meant to be questioned, and so it's too, often from India, and understandably that they hold these texts as sacred, and they aren't to be questioned as like, well, if the word of God is is found in a text, well, you wouldn't question
Yes.
that, right? You wouldn't use your own intellect to try and make questions to the word of God. So so it's good to be clear that we are doing something slightly different here. To, as you mentioned, the pundits, they're probably giving more of an emic perspective on it, that within the culture, right?
Yes.
Whereas in modern times, and the many people like yourself and Jim Mallinson and Edwin kind of maybe straddles the two
Yes.
camps actually. But most of us in modern scholarly, I'm not saying I'm a scholar at all, but in modern yoga are looking from the outside in. So we have to be aware of that. I suppose just to finish this little section before we go on into modern embodiment practices, which I know you specialize in as well. So how do we use the ego? I mean, many people read the Yoga Sutras and they get very confused. And I think that, the thing is with the Yoga Sutras, they can be confusing. It's like, well, Patanjali says I should basically get rid of the ego. In 2.3, we have the sutra, avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, binevasha, klesha. So the 5 poisons, starting with basically not seeing clearly, avidya or mistaken conception, and then lead to the ego, which is a problem, obviously, a big problem. And defined by preference and aversion, right? So these are very concerning, I think, to someone who wants to be a good yoga student and wants to be appropriate to the tradition. And it's like suddenly you find, well, the problem is my ego, and the problem is my preferences towards life. So basically, and I've heard this from my own students over the years, maybe I should become preferenceless. Maybe I should become completely impartial, completely detached to whatever happens in life, not have any preferences because they're egoic, not have any desires or not desires, because that's wrong, my immediate reaction is that's not a good thing, We're not trying to lose the
especially
ego.
not if you decide it with your mind. That's difficult.
Well, even if you didn't, even in modern life, requires us to have an emotional engagement with it. Let's say, I feel, to live fully in it, and that is to have desires and aversions, naturally speaking, because they define the sense of self, individuality. If you get rid of those, then you're kind of floundering in this space of nothingness, right? You cannot make any choices anymore. You're completely lost to life. If you try and lead it in the way that Patanjali originally suggested, because you're not leading it in a monastery after all. You're leading it in a society where, in my perspective, you need a firm sense of ego defined by preferences, by likes and dislikes. They're important.
Yes. What I meant by if you decide, if it's with your mind, it might be difficult. What you just said about your students that sometimes tell you these things, and I've also heard about that. I mean, I remember when I started my journey with yoga, I was 19. And when I did my first teacher training in Shivananda Yoga, I was 21. And we read all of these sutras, and they were like rules. And I thought when I was like beginning of my 20s, I have to, I am that soul, Atman, and I have to disidentify with all the rest. I mean, it really made me somehow, it was a difficult phase in my life, because it's a life where you start to ask yourself, where am I standing? What do I want in life? And then a philosophy comes in that tells you, you should kind of not give too much onto this part of, like, let's say, active lifestyle and so on. But then, it doesn't help. It didn't help me, because we now I know that we are living in this world, and I know that we shouldn't read Patanjali that literally, So whatever, I'm pregnant, I have a baby in my belly. This is Abhinivesha in its main form. I am continuing. I'm building a new life. That means I've been to my doctor 2 days ago, and the baby didn't move so much as it should have or could have in that phase of my pregnancy. And then it started to move, and I was relieved. So yeah, it's alive. It's there. And then I told my doctor, well, I was a bit worried because it's late. She said, yeah, it's late, but you have a very good muscular, muscles in your belly, so you feel it late. It's okay. The baby is fine. It's big. It's normal. and then she said, and I had to think about that now when I just dived into Abhinivesha. But she said, this is a life that you will fear about most, your child's life. And now you already felt that. It would have been very unnatural if you wouldn't have been worried. about that it doesn't move. It would just not have been natural. You will be your whole life concerned about that being. You should already get used to that. And like, yeah, I think that's the case. I think that's you are clinging to life when you're building a new life, and I think we just have to be realistic with that, and just have to be honest with that. And also these scenes in the movie, if someone would put a gun on your head, would you really say, yeah, shoot me, I don't care? I don't know, would you? No, you would, of course, you would cling to your life. Yeah. So I think what Patanjali is asking is something very extreme, and I have to say I find it highly fascinating what he's talking about. I don't want to say like, what a bullshit, it's just who needs that. I find it really fascinating, and I want to understand how this came to be, and I think this philosophy came to be, these thoughts came to be. I think it's high philosophical content that is fun to dive into, and it opens our minds and so on, but it's not what I'm living right now. And this is, I think, very important to keep in mind and to dive into. And then you don't decide with your mind, I need to dissolve my ego and so on. But you see that ego is everywhere, but maybe you can still make it a bit lighter. Yeah.
Well, first of all, congratulations. I did know already because of our correspondences, but that's exciting news. We're pleased for you, and everything's going well. That's great. A second, recently it was kind of funny because I had a similar situation actually with my own mother, and now obviously not a baby anymore. 45-year-old man in the other side of the world most of the time to my mum, living in the UK, and I'd gotten dengue fever right recently, and she was so worried about me, how I was and if I was okay, which I kind of found somewhat, it was kind of somewhat almost amusing. I suppose you should expect your mum to be worried about you, but I kind of expect that there would still be that such a clinging to my own life, as it were. Take it as you will. But on another front, I remember I used to go a lot to see this guy called Tony Parsons in London, not the author Tony Parsons, but a guy who used to speak in London. He probably still does, in fact, in Hampstead. If you're in London and Hampstead on a Saturday afternoon, every once a month he'll speak, and he doesn't claim to be enlightened. But basically, that's the premise of it, is that he had an awakening, and now he says he doesn't live as Tony Parsons. He doesn't, But the point I'd like to make here is that his understanding of this sense of egoless is that the Tony Parsons mechanism is still, because and same it might be said in some yoga texts, because of karma in the body, the Tony Parsons mechanism, or your own ego mechanism, is still going to run. So he says, if someone, as you said, if someone says, puts a gun to your head, you've still got the mechanism in the body. You're going to react. Yeah. And if Tony says, Tony Parsons, would you like spaghetti or would you like pizza? He always used to have a spaghetti before his talk. He used to see him in the restaurant with a glass of wine and spaghetti. Anyway, so he's going to react. He's going to say, I like this, I don't like this. But he's not actually going to hold it as himself. And because we are not in that space, I think we can't fully understand the duality or bipolarity of this kind of way of reacting and having a self that lives in the world, but being completely detached and uninterested at the same time. Because we are in that space, perhaps we don't fully understand that the ego can be held when it needs to be, as a worldly figure, as an individual. But in actuality, you don't have any kind of stickiness. There's no stickiness of the self, bigger self, to being mistaken as that small self anymore. The two are completely detached, but they still exist, at the same time.
Yeah, these are these Jivan Mukti experiences that some people talk about or say they are having. I find it very interesting. I'm not sure how that happens and what to think of that and so on, but I think I can somehow imagine that you are still in life. Is like the wheel of karma is still running. You still have impressions, samskaras, and things going on, but you are somehow, you have become an observant somehow of this other part of yourself. I think, this is clinging to life for sure on my part now too. but it's quite a spooky imagination. I think many people, they just imagine, well, I'm here on life, I'm enjoying life and so on, but I'm liberated. And so I'm, they have this imagination that everything would just feel the same as before, just positive the whole time. And then, but I think if you really think about that, this liberation in life state, as in the Hatha traditions, the Yoga Sutra doesn't talk about that, but the Hatha traditions, they do talk about Jivan Muktis, and sometimes it's just said it's a stoneless state, the Samadhi state. You're still on earth, but you don't feel anything anymore. You don't think much anymore. It's just like running your last things that have to run through, they run, but you're not super involved and so on. Do we wish to live like that? Yeah. But I think if it would happen, and if it's true, if it would happen, you would just be there. And then you would not say, I don't want to be here.
I think the Bhagavad Gita says the same, really, when it's, talking, I can't remember which chapter, but it's a number of times now, even the wise person, even the enlightened person, their karma still has to carry on because they're in the body. So it has to run out. And there was that prarabdha karma, the karma that's attached to the body, right? That comes in with the body and it continues as long as the body's alive. I realize we're running out of time, Laura. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the modern influences on the Yoga Sutras and Vivekananda. Obviously, he was probably the person, many people agree, that brought the sutras back to life in the modern context, prioritizing them as a text for his Raja Yoga, and then really influencing, I suppose, in the way that he took them, the modern context of yoga practice, full stop, in the modern era, right? The Vivekananda was primary in how we take yoga, I think, in the West. Do you want to say anything about embodiment practices as they've gone on, or and reached the 20th, 21st century?
Yes, I mean, Vivekananda, he just came from a different, let's say, background. He was a Brahmin, and he was an intellectual, and he was a monk, of course, and he was a bhakti. So Vivekananda had a certain take on the Yoga Sutra, and we have to see that this was it was not only Vivekananda. He had peers like Dvivedi, for example, who translated even the Yoga Sutra before him. There were translations into English of the Yoga Sutra before Vivekananda. What Vivekananda did, he was rendering the sutra in a modern context and totally separating it from the commentary tradition that we talked about a lot, and wrote his own commentary. And this own commentary was sometimes very far away from the Yoga Sutra tradition as it was like going on in the first and parts of the second millennium. And I mean, Vivekananda was tapping on a trend, and this trend was to he was fluent in English. He had a very good university, how do you say, training. So he was a child of the outcomes of I just forgot the word.
Modernity?
No, not modernity. No, yes, of course, modernity, but colonialization.
Right,
of colonialization. Okay. Of course. So, and Vivekananda was striving, of course, like many of his peers, towards independence of India and so on, but also towards making India and the philosophies of India valid to Western philosophies. And the Yoga Sutra was one of the works that had like best, let's say, ambitions, or I don't know, to get that work, but it needed to be rewritten. And that's what Vivekananda really did. He really framed it. He talks a lot about energy, about physics, and so on. So he framed it in modern terms that Westerners can understand, and made this work really, let's say, modern and valid. I read a bit. I think I didn't read the whole translation back then in my PhD of Vivekananda, but there are things in there where he says, just take some deep breath and repeat Om in your mind while you sit at work. It will even make you better at work. So, in his Yoga Sutra commentary, so Vivekananda says these things that sound very watered down and that sound very somehow practical in a way. You just can't sit at work. You repeat Om sometimes. It will relax you. You can be better at work. It's very capitalistic too, So it's very interesting that these were Indians that framed the Yoga Sutra in such a way. And
on long Western lines, really.
Sorry?
With it along Western, as you mentioned, he was fighting
Completely
against colonialism, but he was fully ensconced in a colonialist mentality in a sense.
Yes,
that,
that's it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
The irony of it was that, I think he was kind of like writing Yoga Sutras for a Western audience, whilst at the same time being kind of quite split, because he was very much an independence fighter,
Yes.
not a fighter, but wanted that, naturally speaking.
Vivekananda made the Yoga Sutra a very practical work. So it was because the Theosophists, they were searching for practical philosophy. They wanted to know not only how, deep states of, they were searching for deep states of not only concentration, but how do you say, when you get out of body experiences and so on. This was part of Western esotericism, and they found it then in Indian texts too. And they thought it's an old tradition here. We want to have practices from India. And Vivekananda was tapping on that discourse that was already there before him because of Theosophists in India, tapping on the discourse, the Yoga Sutra needs to be more practical. We need practices for modern life. But then he did not connect it to practices of the body. That was not his thing. As we all know, he himself was not, I think, a very active person.
No, he wasn't. Maybe he should have been a little bit more. We could say
maybe there are rumors of diabetes.
Might have died so young.
Yes.
Yeah, no, he wasn't up for asana at all. I think he had one go, didn't he? Go and visit a yogi, and then he just I don't like this very much. I think the interesting thing with it is that, again, what he's given the yoga audience of the West is a disembodied practice again, because he feels that when he's looking at the influences that he comes across, like namely transcendentalists and the modern influences in the West that shape his viewpoint. Yeah, it's mind-body split, because that's what the West has traded on since Descartes.
Completely.
It's a mind-body, is a Cartesian split of mind and body.
Yes.
So he goes back to that again and gives us back the mind-body split, and that's what we're struggling with to wrap it up today. That Yoga Sutras
completely. Yes.
Is a disembodied practice, as you mentioned. The Theosophists, which were always interested, trying to train poor Krishnamacharya and his brother to kind of get out of the body and and go into these kind of other worlds with all the different their two gurus, go and visit them, and it was completely otherworldly and disembodied practices, which is. I think is where we're still struggling today. Is to shake off the heritage that we have of this this split between mind and body that Vivekananda unfortunately seemed to really add to a great deal.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's always has to be seen in context too. I mean, our modern context with disembodied life conditions, like working with machines, not being in nature anymore, not maybe having lots of contact with other people, and not moving as much as we should to feel like normal human beings. Is our context. And for us, this message might be, for many of us, poison, to just say, well, there's this body and we have to disregard it and discard it. Is that a word? And so it just adds the grain of salt to what is already there, So we might not be needing that. That's also why this might not have been the most popular rendering of the Yoga Sutra in the end. It is extremely important, and it was extremely important for kind of making the Yoga Sutra really prominent and for searching this daily life and practical application. But then I think P.K.C. Iyengar was the one who really, really made the sutra into a work that is somehow really watered down, that is very Vedantic, that means monistic, and very practical, really on modern asana practice. I think there was BKS Iyengar, who did a very, very big and very famous and prominent step in that direction. And what he did, and this is very important, I think we don't have much time to tap onto that again, but the physical culture movement that was kind of absorbing Hatha Yoga when it came to the West, the physical culture movement, many of these let's say gymnastic systems that we had in the West here in the 1910s, 1920s, they were holistic systems. They were not systems that wanted to just work out the body and to just kind of seeing it, treating as a machine, but they were already reacting to modernity and to this. We are just sitting in front of working with machines. We are totally disembodied. We need bodily practices that are holistic, that are kind of teaching us to be better persons, to have an ethical lifestyle. And we need it for concentration. So many of, for example, Elsa Gindler, she's a very, very fascinating person, a woman in the 1920s here in Germany, in Berlin. She said, we are moving our body and it's always connected with concentration. We need to deeply concentrate on what we're doing. Otherwise, we're not doing it holistically. We're just moving our machine and so on. So concentration was also a big, big topic in these parts of our culture, actually of our history. And I think BKS Iyengar was also influenced by that. So because it just came into modern yoga, when it entered the West, it just connected with these practices because they were similar and they were holistic. They were not just concerned with the body and like sports. I don't know. These gymnasts, they were always saying, we are not doing sports. It's for us, it's about the whole being. We want to really have all the other realms involved too in our movement practices.
Yeah. I think you touched upon an important point, too late perhaps to expand it further, but you have figures like Del Sarte and Genevieve Stebbins and people, and people like this that are actually, even the modern Muller and Book and people like that, they're all doing something which is, they don't framing exactly as gymnastics. They are suggesting, especially Del Sarte, it's emotional. When you move the body, it's emotional. It's emotional expressionism. Yes. So it's kind of funny that, Vivekananda comes over and kind of almost stubs all that out, almost squashes all that down, which is an embodied movement that's integral to the West already. And
I think he didn't know.
Is it kind of interplay between the two, really, between kind of the West and the East, right? And it goes back and forth. I mean, and Anya Foxon, obviously, and has written great books on this kind of interplay. Is it yoga?
Yeah, it's interesting because Vivekananda mentions Del Sarte. Because he mentions this, that he says there are all these movement systems now in the West that are concerned with the body and so on, but we are not concerned about that. Just look at Del Sarte if you want to know more about that. We are concerned about the yoga, like in tune with the Yoga Sutra, with the mind, with concentration. So I think he must have met Genevieve Stebbins on this Chicago World Congress there of religions in, I don't know, 1890. What was it, 96?
I always get, I think 6, yeah.
Yes, and he must have met her and seen her somehow and knew about this huge trend in the West of holistic gymnastics. But for him, I think it had too much to do with the body and had but that it was really a system working with energies in the body and with breath, a lot of breath work. Anya Foxon highlighted that in her book. And that this breath work was also connected to higher realms, not only to your own body and pneuma, prana and so on. So we have lots of similarities, but I think Vivekananda just wasn't aware about this holistic dimension of that gymnastics that we had at that time.
Well, I mean, he just had, as you said, he didn't have an interest in it. We don't have time. We don't have time to mess around with all this stuff. I mean, So the book is, if you want to know, I think, Is It Yoga? I think that's the title of it. Is It Yoga by Anya Foxon and Kristen Kubery.
Yes.
And well worth a read.
Yes.
And Light on Yoga Sutras. Laura mentioned
BKS
also
Iyengar's.
BKS Iyengar's Light on Yoga Sutras, a good place to dive in. We have to admit that BKS did have. I would be interested to know his other influences on BKS, because he definitely did have outside. I mean, I know one of them was Krishnamacharya. He had a long relationship with Krishnamacharya and was influenced definitely by Krishnamacharya's perhaps pragmatism. But I'd like to know other influences on him, because he definitely did a work on the Yoga Sutras, which is innovative, but applicable to perhaps to the modern practitioner, which is where we find ourselves today. So, I mean, I don't like to run too much over, but, in our discourse, in our pre-podcast chat, Laura mentioned the last two questions that she was always ready for. So I assume you've planned some answers for our last two questions. So knowing that I do ask these last two questions, I actually wouldn't have asked them today because we had a very serious chat. So it seems a bit discordant to put our last two frivolous questions in the end. But why not, just to break it up and give a lightheartedness to the ending of the podcast. So let's imagine you don't know what I'm going to ask you. What?
Maybe you have new questions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I should come up with a sudden surprise, a completely different question. But no, I mean, I'm not that innovative myself, unfortunately. So what are your guilty pleasure and your, I can't even remember it, your inspiration, and something that inspires you? So just to round it off.
Well, I thought about that a little bit, not too much, but I think what inspires me, what I see these days, especially that it inspires me, is curiosity. I mean, it comes back to actually maybe the take on the Yoga Sutra. And when I see myself back 20 years back, and then I see many people today also looking at these texts, it gets very dogmatic. And for me, like the curiosity sometimes is lacking. Just really having an open mindset and trying to find out and know what there is to know. And then maybe also to admit that there are things we don't know, we cannot know, but that we might consider possible. Yeah. So have an open mindset of, for example, I consider possible that what Patanjali says is true, but I don't want to believe it. And I don't know it by personal experience. So, and I find that very inspiring if someone is really close to, let's say, reality and is curious about more still, but then very close to where am I right now, and what can I know more, and how can I go on and not just keep standing on my dogmatic viewpoint. And so I think that inspires me a lot. And I had some people in my surrounding, and still have my father, for example. That is a very good example for that kind of take on life, and not taking yourself too seriously then too, if you're curious and open-minded. Yeah. And your second question, yeah.
We need more of that. Yeah.
Yes.
And the second question, this is an easy one, the guilty pleasure one. Yeah.
I don't know. It was very hard actually for me. Not because I'm like a saint, just because I don't
There's
feel
so many. You don't feel guilt, right?
Maybe I don't feel guilty for my pleasures, and I also don't eat much chocolate. You said don't say chocolate.
You can't say chocolate.
I would never have said chocolate. I don't eat that much chocolate. I don't know. I don't even like that. But I think my guilty pleasure might be that I like, of course, when I have the time, but sometimes I also do it when I don't have the time. It's just lying around and looking in German you say ein Loch in die Wand gucken, just looking a hole into the wall. I don't know, just lying there and doing nothing, like nothing. I like that a lot.
That's a good one. That is a good one. That I've never had it before.
Cool.
Definitely.
Because sometimes
like
you feel lazy then, so it's a little bit of guilt.
The next time I'm lying around, I'll think about that, looking a hole into the wall. I think,
yes.
Yeah, well, we don't have a word for it. I know you're famous for compound words and putting words together there to make a new meaning. We kind of say something like, looking into the middle distance, or just I don't know. I don't know. We don't have a good word to say it. Yeah, I like that. I mean, because I think I missed that a lot. Like when I used to smoke, you used to have a cigarette and you didn't do anything. You don't have a phone, right? It was many years ago. Phone, so I was just looking, have a cigarette, and you're just looking into the middle distance. You're just looking, and it's just great. We don't have enough time of just being these days.
That's it.
If you just sit somewhere these days and look in a cafe having a coffee, without your phone, people would just come and arrest you for being mad.
That's
You
it.
know, it's a shame because, we're just being, we're just looking and
Yeah,
being. And
we're just being.
we need more of
And
that.
then we need a cigarette or whatever we need to pretend that we're doing something, but actually we just don't want to do anything.
Have a packet of cigarettes and just take them out and just pretend,
Yeah.
That would be it.
So nice last questions. Thanks for that.
Well, it's a nice ending, a little bit of frivolity at the end of a more heavy chat. But, I hope it's a good start for people. And thanks so much, Laura, for coming on and pointing a few really salient things out about the sutras. And, we'll put Laura's contact details in the show notes. And just want to say a personal thanks to you again for bearing with me as we scheduled this podcast, because this chat has been going on for months back and forth, trying to get a time when we can both do it. And I was ill with dengue, and Laura has had some difficulties, and so we finally got together. And I just hope that everyone enjoys it as much as at least I have. I hope you've enjoyed it too, Laura. If you like it, let us know, and we'll do a part 2, because I definitely think that you've got a lot more to say, and we didn't cover the modern era half as much as we could, I think. So
that's
thanks
true.
again, Laura,
for inviting me. It was lots of fun, and thanks for your curiosity for inviting so many people, and to just let this community kind of have an exchange by that too. That's nice. Thanks.
Yeah, that's what I hope for. Thank you.